All right. So, 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗟, is it actually possible for English learners to remember everything that they're learning in English?
Maybe that's not really the problem. It's not like you are forgetting words. It's not about remembering per se, but about maybe moving or transferring some words and expressions you want into your active vocabulary box so you can start using them more often. I was reflecting in preparation for today's podcast. I was reflecting on my English learning journey, my English as it is today, my English level as it is today. And I realized that when it comes to vocabulary, I don't necessarily use all the words that I actually know. Like on my day-to-day routine for work, here to record the podcast, to teach a class, it's almost like I know a bunch of words and expressions, yes, but I don't necessarily use all of them. And then I remember this concept called active vocabulary versus passive vocabulary. And it is a thing. In my brain, I like to compartmentalize things. So it's almost like I have two boxes in my brain, In one box, I have the passive vocabulary there, which is quite large. And it's all the words, expressions that I actually know and understand. If I see them in a movie, somebody using them, I recognize them. But I don't necessarily use them when I speak English, when I write in English, like on my day-to-day life. And then I have the second box, which is the active vocabulary box. It's a bit smaller, and those are the words and expressions that I actually use more frequently in my day-to-day life. So I think when we talk about this topic of forgetting the things you learn in English, or forgetting the words in this case, maybe that's not really the problem. Like, it's not like you are forgetting words, because, for you guys out there, if you are at an intermediate, upper intermediate level, chances are you already have a very good base knowledge of English, vocab and expressions, everything. But maybe the problem is that's all part of our passive vocabulary, not active vocabulary. That's why when you see us here in the podcast using a word or expression, you understand. When you watch a movie or a series, you understand, that word, that phrase. But when it's time for you to speak English, for example, you don't necessarily use that. So why? Because, that word might not be part of your active vocabulary.
I think something else that's important to note here is it's not something that you should have hard feelings about. If something that you learned, it's still in that passive vocabulary box, because this even happens in our native languages. I know for me, even an English speaker, I know tons and tons of words in English compared to any other language I've learned, just because the sheer amount of years that I've been having exposure to this language, right, as a native speaker. That said, though, I have a lot of passive vocabulary in English, and listener or any of you that are listening or watching us right now, if you actually pay attention, I recommend even trying this out. Next time you're reading a more advanced piece of literature in your native language, or maybe reading a news article, anything that tends to have more obscure or less commonly used language from your native language in it, pay attention and see if there's any words that stand out to you as the kind of words that you understand what that means, whether it's because you've learned that word at some point or just through the context you're understanding it. And actually reflect for just a couple seconds. Would I be able to bring that up in my speaking? Would that word come to me naturally if I was having a conversation with a friend, or even if I was giving a presentation or speaking with someone at work in a more formal setting? And I think that you'll find that there's tons of words like this even in your native language. This happens to me now that I'm aware of it. It happens to me all the time, that I'll be in a meeting and there's a word we'll say it's on the tip of my tongue. Like, I know it's there in my brain. It's just I can't produce it in that moment because it's not in my active vocabulary box, at least in that moment.
I do want to backtrack a little bit, Ethan, because you used some nice pieces of vocab here. So first of all, you said you shouldn't have hard feelings about this. What does it mean when you have hard feelings about something?
We don't normally actually say like I have hard feelings about something, just so people know. It's usually used in the negative of like no hard feelings, which might be used in a sense if you're wanting to, encourage someone because something bad happened, or maybe you gave them a constructive piece of feedback or something like that. Like, if I'm correcting your English, I'd say, no hard feelings. You're still a learner. No worries. So it's basically saying like, don't feel bad about it. Don't beat yourself up about it. It's another way to say that.
Nice. No hard feelings, we say, right? That's the proper collocation,
The
right?
collocation. Right.
Nice, nice. And you also use the word sheer, the sheer amount
hmm
of words, I guess. What's that? The sheer amount.
When you say a sheer amount of something, it just means a uncountable amount of something. It's a very tremendous amount of something. Something I've recognized here in friends and so on is that depending on the mother tongue that they had at home, which for some people it will be both, but for a lot of people it was Spanish or Catalan they learn first, and then when they're like 4 or 5 years old, they go to school and they learn the other one. So they're still bilingual. They're still learning it as a child, but there's also always certain things that come for them more naturally in their mother tongue. And the other thing is that there can be a certain topic or a certain set of words that a person knows in one of the languages and not the other, just because of being exposed in a certain situation to that set of vocabulary and not not knowing it in a counterpart. Like, for example, with my partner, like he will know fruits and vegetables, for example, like anything in the kitchen that he learned in Catalan, but he doesn't know a lot of them in Spanish. So this can just lead to kind of funny situations. A person say, "How do you say it like that word in Spanish?" Even though they're a native speaker.
Amazing.
So I think there's hope for all of us when I see this kind of thing.
There's still hope. I like that. That's interesting. Yeah.
So what we wanted to do today to not just talk about the phenomenon of learning and remembering and forgetting and activating and having more passive vocabulary and so on, is to actually give you guys a strategy that you can use to start activating more of that passive vocabulary so that you have it at your disposal when you need it. So we're going to actually go through this using our methodology called the RealLife Way. 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗟 and I did a really nice episode of the podcast where we went all over how you can use the RealLife Way to become a fluent, natural English speaker. So we won't go too into depth about all the specifics here, but highly recommend if you've not yet listened or watched that episode, you should definitely check it out. But we have the 3 components of the RealLife Way are connect it, live it, and activate it. So we're going to go through each one of those components and look at how can you apply this to activating that vocabulary that you have in your head. So first of all, connect it has to do with connecting to your why, for your deeper purpose of learning the language, and with your identity. So first of all, talking about purpose, I would even just sit down for a minute or two, or you could even pause this episode and just write down really quickly, why do you actually need to expand your vocabulary? Why do you need to activate your vocabulary? It seems like something really, really simple, really mundane, but actually doing this can help you to stay motivated when you get in those periods, because learning vocabulary can be very challenging. It's not always something that's super fun to do. It requires studying and so on. So knowing and being able to come back to, why am I doing this? Why is this important for me? How is this going to help me in my life? Or as we like to say, be the doorway to living my dreams. Connecting back to that will push you through the tedium of needing to study long lists of vocabulary or studying the vocabulary that you're learning, which will come back to in your everyday experiences.
I like the word you use there, mundane. It's a great advanced word. What is something mundane?
That was one I was trying to think of it. It was one of those ones I had on the tip of my tongue, and I wasn't sure if it was going to come to me. I wasn't sure if it was accurate.
It came out.
It came out. That's one of those things, though. It's a great expression. It's on the tip of my tongue. So if something is mundane, it means it actually comes from the Latin word for world, which is, I'm not sure actually what it is, but it's probably similar in Spanish, like mundo, meaning having to do with the earth. So we tend to use this as something that's earthly, or it's not something that's out in space. It's not something out of this world, right? It's something simple here, familiar, that kind of thing.
And to complement what you were talking about, related to connecting it, right, to your identity and to your purpose. Speaking of identity, that is very true, because if you connect your English to who you are and to what your interests are, that will naturally guide you to what kinds of words or vocabulary you need to learn, or you want to learn. In my case, for example, I love music. I have my guitar here in my back, as you guys can see it, right? Those of you on YouTube. So for me, as a musician, it makes perfect sense to learn how to name the parts of the guitar. So for me, it makes sense to learn words like headstock, strings, neck, pickups and knobs and body,
There's a lot of those words I don't even know.
Yeah, fretboard, Why? Because I play music. It's part of who I am, you see? But maybe for somebody else who is not very much into music or who doesn't play any instrument, why would you learn that? So yeah,
Mhm.
connecting your English to your identity and to your interests, it's crucial.
We might, by the way, call that jargon, which is like a set of vocabulary that has to do with a certain profession or certain, for example, music. That's some of the words you were saying there are musical jargon. Uh, One of the things I actually took note of, for example, is exactly what you're saying is that it's good to reflect on your identity to know what sort of vocabulary should I learn. And for Thiago, it makes perfect sense. Maybe with his English, he wants to connect with other musicians. But as valuable is to also think about what kind of things do I not need to focus on, and so I shouldn't feel bad that that vocabulary is just in my passive vocabulary, or I don't know that vocabulary yet. Even for me as a native speaker, like legal jargon, legal vocabulary, I like some different series and stuff that are about legal things, but they'll use vocabulary that I don't really know. I have a sense of what it means just because I've heard it in different moments of my life. My dad's a lawyer, so I've at some point I've heard these things, but it's not important that I have those in my active vocabulary. Hopefully I don't get into a situation where that becomes necessary. But for the most part, I'm hoping in my life that's not going to be so necessary in English or other languages that I'm learning. Now, if you're a lawyer, or if you're studying law, or if it's something that really fascinates you, you might be more interested in spending the time that is necessary to learn that kind of vocabulary. I think too, just to add on this before we move on, it can be really valuable too to think about specific situations. Let's take, for example, that you're going to be interviewing for a job and you're really excited about this job, and it's a company that works in, something having to do with the environment. And you realize, I don't really have a lot of vocabulary to talk about the environment. And so you might start considering, how can I attain more vocabulary that has to do with the environment, so that when I'm in this interview and they ask me different questions about, why do you want to work here? What do you like about the company and so on, that you can give a competent answer using the words that you really need to have to be able to talk about that at a high level. So, you might start listening to some podcasts that are on environmental topics. You might watch a documentary. You might have a conversation even on the RealLife English app and try to, just use some of these new words that you're learning, maybe teach it to other people, which can be a really great way to learn. But that's a really great way to make sure that you're exposing yourself to this vocabulary, and then you're activating that vocabulary by speaking with other people, by writing down example sentences, by using some different tools, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
And you've already started touching on living it, right? Which is the next component we have here for our method. You mentioned, watching maybe videos about that topic you are trying to learn more words about, or listening to a podcast about it, right?
And I think a really important thing here, so, we say live it is make it fun, natural, convenient, and everyday. So the really important thing here is, say you're not living in an English country, or even if you are living in an English speaking country, because I've had students who live in the United States, for example, but they're still, they have a family from their home country. They're really struggling to make local friends. They're struggling to really immerse themselves because at home they're speaking in their native language. So it might still be relevant for you. You really need to build habits that make it effortless for you to have this immersion experience. So it's every single minute possible of your day, you need to be listening to things in English, listening or watching things in English. And the great thing here is that this is the most fun part of learning, because it's reflecting on what are the things that I already love. Maybe it's watching TV series, maybe it's reading novels, maybe it's listening to podcasts, whatever that is, and then finding things that you can do in the target language, in English in this case. So, you make it effortless by, fun, natural, and convenient by thinking about things that you can do that you already love, but in English. And it makes it really easy to make it a habit too, because you look forward to these things. You look forward to watching your new favorite TV series. You look forward to listening to a podcast while you're working out, and so on. So we've done a lot of other lessons too about habit building and how you do this and so on, that we can link in the description or in the show notes. But doing those two things, it's going to be immensely valuable when we come to talk about vocabulary, because you can specify this about something you want to learn, or you can just make sure you're doing it all the time. But you're going to ensure that whether or not you're deliberately learning those new words, you're going to be encountering new words all the time, right?
If you do that, some words will naturally make their way into your active vocabulary. Some words are easier for you to learn and pick up, and other words are a little bit harder. You need maybe to, think about them more often or see them more often. But in any case, it's a great way for you to improve vocab. If you're not consuming content in English daily yet, start doing that.
And even if you're already doing it, think of like, how can I do that even more?
Exactly.
It's always like something you should be saying, how can I maximize my exposure throughout the day?
Yeah, that's so true.
So the last part is activating it. So, we've talked about maybe the more philosophical parts. We talked about the more fun parts. So let's talk about the more getting our hands dirty and actually doing the difficult work that comes to really, if you're really serious about getting to advanced levels in the language, you have to do this. With what we were just talking about having a lot of passive exposure to the language all the time, something that can be really important, just to like a first small step in activating, is keeping a notepad. Whether that's, if you're old fashioned, you prefer to have a small notepad in your pocket. This is what I used to do back in the day before smartphones. Or, if you love doing everything on your phone, then just using whatever app that you use, but having some way that you can always take notes. So you're watching a TV series, you're listening to a podcast, there's an interesting new word or expression that you hear or see, and you can take note of it right in that moment and then transfer that new vocabulary that I captured. So it's really important. Look it up in a dictionary. So don't use a translator. Don't just translate to your language, because your goal probably is to start thinking in English and not having to translate in your head. So to do this, always try to understand the dictionary definition of the word, and use the word and then, the definition to remember this. And then the other things you can do, this all depends too on how much time that you have, which, when I was younger, I had much more time to do these things. Now I would do a simpler approach. But if you can use images, if you can use sound, if you can use anything else that's going to give more hooks into your brain, into your memory. Something you could even try if you're a little bit artistic, or you're not afraid of getting your hands dirty, then draw a picture. Draw your very own picture for like what this new word, this new expression makes you think of. Even, use the sentence of where you heard it, or look up other example sentences. Something I used to do was when you go on Google search, you can click on news and you can search there for a word, for an expression, and it'll bring up news stories that are using that. So you can take like real life examples, which is really nice. And then finally, we talked, I mentioned that we would share a tool that's really useful for this, and it's called spaced repetition software. I used to use Anki, Memrise on iPhone because the Anki app is super expensive. I used one called Flashcards Deluxe, which is pretty much the same thing. And these technologies are amazing because they're basically set up to work in the same way that your brain retains new information. And that basically is that when we first hear something, or we first learn a new word, we're going to forget it almost instantly. Like you need to see that again a lot at the beginning. You need to see it in 5 minutes and then a few hours later for it to start making those hooks in your brain. But then it starts becoming more into your midterm, into your long-term memory. So, it can be a few days before you see it again. It'll still stay in your active vocabulary. And then, days turn into weeks, turn into a month, turn into, you're never going to forget that word. So using something like this, deliberately make sure that you are moving it from that passive vocabulary. Well, really moving it from a word you don't know to your passive vocabulary to your active vocabulary. It's obviously like something that you have to do deliberately, and especially all the work that goes into putting things in there. But, we have 5 minutes all the time. This is, something I do like anytime I'm waiting in line somewhere, I'm having to, go on the bus somewhere, I would whip out my phone and for 5 minutes be studying my vocabulary. So, it's pretty simple. Now, this is a lot of work. So what I would highly recommend is we've made it a lot easier for you with the Real Life English app, because we give you the most important vocabulary, expressions, and anything else that we think is important for you to add to your active vocabulary for each lesson. And we have our own spaced repetition software in the app. So, you don't have to do any of the work of looking for the definition, of adding in an audio file of how you're supposed to correctly pronounce that, of looking for the images. We do all of the dirty work for you. So you definitely should check that out if you have not yet. And that said, maybe we could just take a break really quickly and give a shout out to one of our special listeners.
All right, this one goes to Kumar. And Kumar says, this app is really different from other English learning apps. I've been using this app for some days only, but this app makes me feel better and it helps me overcome my shyness. It is a great platform to learn English.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kumar. So we just talked about the vocabulary part of the app, but there's so many other features. For example, that you can be practicing your speaking every single day. That's another really important thing. for activating. This is something that anytime I learn a new word, I have the benefit of living in a country where, if I learn a word in Catalan, I can use it pretty instantly. But try to use it as soon as possible after you learn it. And we've given you a really convenient resource where anytime, anywhere, you just press a button and you can instantly start a conversation in English. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already. And we look forward to seeing you there. So I know I hear a lot from learners, usually when they talk about forgetting things, it might be in the context of, for example, they get in a conversation and they just feel like they've learned all these words and they're not available to them, or they learned a new expression and they have an opportunity to use it, but then it doesn't come to their mind when they really need it. But, we've talked a lot about these kind of things, but that's not the only time where people will forget things. Oftentimes too, we study for hours different grammar rules, right? And then it comes time to use it, and we're doubting about, actually I don't know right now which tense I should use. So, what would you say about how can learners better remember certain grammar rules when it comes time to speak?
Mm-hmm. There is something called fossilized mistakes, we call it, which is basically a mistake that a learner has spent so much time making that it kind of becomes natural for that person to speak it wrong, And those mistakes are really hard to fix because they have become fossilized. The person has been making them for so long that, it's really hard to fix that. So again, bringing self-awareness to the discussion, it's important that you become self-aware or aware of what those fossilized mistakes are. What are those little mistakes that you always make every time you speak English or every time you write in English? I find that having a teacher in that case could be beneficial because, a teacher or a more experienced friend who knows more English than you could listen to you and give you some feedback and kind of diagnose, what the weak areas are or what that mistake is, so you become aware of it. This is very useful, but you can also do that self-reflection on your own. All right, you can record yourself, listen to yourself. Once you become aware of that, I would say repetition is crucial. You got to repeat the right way over and over and over again. It reminds me of a student of mine. She used to make this mistake that is really common among Brazilian learners. She used to say, it depends of. It depends of, the preposition of there. Because for us in Portuguese, it makes more sense to use of in Portuguese. But in English, we don't say it depends of, we say it depends on. That's the right preposition there. It depends on. So first of all, I pointed that out to her. So you see the self-awareness there, like, oh, we identify that. And then throughout the week, she would work on that by herself, like, repeating, it depends on, it depends on, it depends on. She would write sentences with it depends on, it depends on. And then every class we had after that for a while, whenever she was speaking and she would say sometimes it depends of, you see the fossilized mistake kicking in there, I would just do this. I would just signal to her, like, oh, like something happened there, something, and then she would immediately become aware again, oh yeah, it depends on. It's that work of repetition. First, you identify what that is, and man, you spend some time repeating that. I guarantee that if you become aware of that fossilized mistake, and you think about it every day, and you are always being reminded of it every day for, let's say, a month, by the end of the month, you should be able to fix it already. If not a month, do it for another month, 2 months, But if you do that, it's almost inevitable that you will fix that. But you see, it has to be deliberate. That's the point, yeah? It cannot be something sporadic, like, you do it every once in a while.
For me, it almost makes me think about when you're rewriting a file, on a computer. If we think of our brains like a computer, it's like you're having to rewrite that file. And obviously on a computer, it's a lot easier than it is in our brain. It requires many, many times of going over it until you're able to replace that fossilized mistake, that pattern that you've created in your head that's wrong. I know, like, I was trying to think because, like, now I'm more active. I've started learning Portuguese again, and I'm making these all the time. I like have a friend I'm speaking with a lot, and he'll correct me sometimes. And I know there's like one that I've made a lot of times, and it's like coming out of Spanish, and every time I get that wrong. So like now I'm in this process of trying to repeat it a lot so that I stop making that fossilized mistake. But it's not coming to me now. But I also suffered this a lot when I was studying for the C1 in Catalan. I remember because in Catalan, actually, because it's a bilingual country, this will happen a lot, that there's a lot of barbarisms. So there's a lot of things on the street that people accept as being correct, even though, when you go to take a test, it's not actually correct, because it's an influence from Spanish. And I had a lot of these that I had to relearn. And it was the same thing that I just would repeat it to myself over and over and over again. And eventually I was able to pick up the right way of saying it. And now it's something that has stuck with me. And it's nice to actually be speaking more correctly than even a lot of native speakers are, which is a funny thing to think about. But yeah.
To bring that word that you used in today's episode again, in that case, it's about the sheer amount of repetition, let's say. You got to beat it in your head, constantly until you get it right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe our brains they're less like a computer and more like one of those stone tablets that they had to pound, something into to write something.
To engrave it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And the beautiful thing about this is that it also applies to pronunciation. The fossilized mistake that you always mispronounce a word, or you never get that sound right, even though you have already learned it, right? The same thing applies. This applies to vocab, to grammar, and also to pronunciation. Yeah. So when you learn we teach connected speech all the time in our content. So focus on one specific connected speech pattern there. And man, spend 1 or 2 months repeating words with that sound or phrases with that sound every day until you start internalizing it. The same principle.
Now we have today's big challenge.
The big challenge today. Let's practice internalizing new words by exposure. So you will listen to this short podcast episode. The link will be in the description or in the show notes. As you're listening, whenever you hear a more advanced word or expression or something that you want to internalize that catches your attention, you will write it down. At the end, you should review your list and try to create one example sentence using each expression. By simply doing that, you'll be already activating those words by bringing them into your active vocabulary. So just to recap here, listen to the podcast that we're going to link it here. Take notes of vocab or words that catch your attention, and then make a list of example sentences with those words. All right. Once you're done, share your list with us with a comment on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, you can also send us an email if you prefer at hello@reallifeglobal.com. And if you prefer, you can also send us a voice message reading your example sentences with the words you chose. All right. Just remember to keep it short. All the links will be in the description or in the show notes for you to do this challenge. All right.
Oh, yeah. So let's look at some of the responses from one of our recent big challenges. So on episode 350, we asked, what do you think that actually fulfills you in life? So do you want to share some of those comments we got on YouTube, Thiago?
All right. So this first one comes from Kaylin, I believe. And Kaylin says, for me, what makes me fulfilled in life is to feel and enjoy life. I'm here not to survive, but to live. To live, I mean, I'm willing to fail when I decide to put myself out of my comfort zone, and I enjoy my life, my journey, and adventure. Apart from that, I want to be present and feel the precious chance of love. All right. Very nice.
That's really sweet.
Very sweet. And the next one comes from Simone. And Simone says, what fulfills me in life is improving myself in all aspects. Life is short, people say, and I agree with this statement because every day we have so many things to learn, and each day is unique. I love Real Life English podcast because they touch on topics that go deep in the soul. Congratulations, guys.
Oh, it's nice to hear that these are going deep to the soul. All right. So thanks so much for joining us today. Hopefully some of this advice has been useful for you to start activating some of that dormant vocabulary and even all the grammar that you're putting all that hard work into studying, pronunciation, and so much more. And if you want a free way to support us because you're enjoying these lessons, then leave us a 5-star review on wherever you're listening to this. It could be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that allows you to do that. And, of course, if you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and the bell down below because it helps us to reach more people and impact more people's English learning, help them have some of the same progress that you're having with us. And remember, no matter what divides us, that which unites us is far greater. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. And in particular, we tried to choose books that have had some sort of significant impact on Thiago or my life. Each of us will give you 5. And that are in particular good for people who are anywhere between the intermediate to advanced level. And even reading these books might help to bump up your English. So kind of give you some resources that'll help you go from being more stuck on that intermediate plateau to breaking through to advanced level.